The trap my parents escaped was never the real trap, and they celebrated surviving it for 3 years before they understood what they had actually walked into. And I want to tell you about the moment my mother called me and said, "Eleanor, we need to talk about the house," and I said, "I know, Mom, I own it," and she went quiet, in the specific way people go, quiet when a thing they believed was temporary turns out to be permanent. And my mother had believed a lot of things were temporary, including my marriage to a man named Daniel Voss, who had $40 in his savings account the year we got married, and who my father had looked at across a dinner table 9 years before that phone call and said, "You will amount to nothing," and who had sat across from my father and said with the most genuine calm I have ever witnessed in another human being, "That is your opinion, sir," and my father had disowned me the following week, and my mother had called to say she agreed with the decision. And I had hung up, and I had not called back for 2 years, and by the time I did, Daniel and I had already started building the first trap, which was not actually the first trap at all. Hey guys, welcome back. And if this is your first time here, you landed on exactly the right video. I'm so glad you're here. My name is Eleanor Voss, and I am 37 years old, and I married Daniel when I was 24, and broke, and certain, and my parents cut me off because Daniel drove a 12-year-old car and worked as a contractor and did not come from the kind of family my parents had spent their lives performing for. And I want to be clear about something before I go further, which is that I do not come from extraordinary wealth. My parents were comfortable, and they had a house they were proud of in a neighborhood they had spent 20 years cultivating an identity around. And what they could not survive was the idea that their daughter had chosen someone whose bank account did not confirm their taste. And so they let me go, and I took Daniel's hand, and we walked into a life they had decided was beneath them, and we built it into something they never saw coming. The first trap looked like this. 2 years after the disownment, I called my mother, and I said, "I want to rebuild the relationship." And my mother said she had been waiting for me to come to my senses, and I said, "I have." And that was partially true, and partially the beginning of something longer, and we began having monthly dinners, and my parents watched Daniel with the specific attention of people waiting to be proven right, and Daniel was unfailingly polite and quietly competent, and said very little about work when they asked, and my father interpreted the silence as shame, and my mother interpreted it as limitation, and they were interpreting a performance that Daniel and I had discussed on the drive to every one of those dinners, and the performance was simple, which was, let them believe what they already believe, because comfortable people are careless people, and careless people make mistakes, and my parents were very comfortable and very careless. And within 18 months, my father had made a mistake. The mistake was that my father's business partner of 14 years had been moving money, and my father had not been watching closely enough. And by the time it became visible, the damage was significant. And my father was 61 years old and looking at a financial situation that was going to require selling assets. And the asset he did not want to sell was the house. And I knew about the business partner situation 4 months before my father told me because Daniel had been doing renovation, contracting work for a building my father's company owned, and the site manager had mentioned the financial difficulties without knowing who Daniel was married to, and Daniel had come home and told me, and we had sat at our kitchen table and we had looked at each other, and I had said, "How long do we have?" And Daniel had said maybe 6 months before they have to make decisions. And I had said, "Okay," and I had picked up my phone, and I had called our financial advisor, and I had said, "We need to talk about a property purchase." Here is what my parents believed was the trap. I offered to loan the money when my father finally told me about the business partner, and my father accepted because the alternative was worse, and the loan was real, and the terms were fair, and I was genuinely helping them. And my father paid it back over 14 months. And when he finished, he called me and he said, "Eleanor, I want you to know your mother, and I misjudged Daniel." And I said, "I appreciate that, Dad," and he said, "He's a good man." And I said, "I know." And my father felt the relief of a man who had survived something difficult with family support. And he told his friends his daughter had come through for them, and his friends said, "That's wonderful, Gerald." And my father felt the specific warmth of a person who has been rescued by someone they underestimated and decided that meant the story was over, and the story was not over. The story was just arriving at the place I had always been pointing it toward. What my parents did not know was that while my father was repaying the loan, Daniel and I had been in conversations with the estate agent handling the property 3 blocks from my parents' house that had come onto the market, and we had purchased it and renovated it and rented it at a profit. And while my father was telling his friends about Eleanor coming through for us, Daniel had been building a property portfolio that now included 6 units across 2 states. And while my mother was updating her opinion of Daniel from limitation to acceptable, Daniel had been quietly introduced through a colleague to the private lender who held the secondary position on my parents' mortgage and had been paying close attention to the repayment timeline and my parents' financial recovery. And the recovery was not as complete as my father believed it was, and the house was still carrying more debt than it appeared from the outside. And Daniel knew this, and I knew this, and we waited. My parents' house came to us the way things come to you when you have been patient enough, which is without drama and without announcement, and with a phone call from an estate agent who said your name was provided as a potential buyer by the lender. And I said, yes, we're interested, and the price was fair, and the situation was straightforward, and my parents needed to sell, and we were positioned to buy. And I called my mother before the paperwork was final, and I said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." And she said, "What is it?" "Eleanor," and I said, "Daniel and I are buying the house." And she said, "What house?" And I said, "Your house." And she went quiet, and then she said, "That's not possible." And I said, "It's actually in process." And she said, "Eleanor and I said, I want you to know that we'd like you to stay in it." And I said, "We're not asking you to leave. We'd like to discuss a rental arrangement that works for everyone." And my mother said, "I don't understand." And I said, "I know." And I gave her a moment. And then I said, "Daniel, and I have been building toward this for about 8 years. And she said, 8 years. And I said, "We started the day Dad called him nothing." The rental arrangement is fair, and my parents have lived in their house uninterrupted. And Daniel has been nothing but professional in every interaction regarding the property. And my father called me 6 months after the sale and said, "I owe you," both more than an apology. And I said, "You don't owe us anything, Dad. The rent covers it." And he laughed, in the surprised way people laugh when they realize a joke is on them, and has been on them for longer than they knew. And my mother has never directly addressed the disownment, and I have not pushed it, because some things are addressed by circumstances more cleanly than by conversations. And the circumstance is that my parents live in a house that belongs to the man my father called nothing, and they pay rent to the daughter. They decided had bad judgment. And every month when that payment processes, I think about Daniel sitting across from my father at that dinner table, 26 years old with $40 in his savings, and saying with complete calm, "That is your opinion, sir." And I think he knew even then that opinions are just the first trap, and the real one takes longer to build, but it holds forever.